Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I've been wondering if the poor people who live at number 40 in 2nd Street get lots of musical theatre fans ringing their doorbell. What a mistaker to maker, as they used to say on television. Well, welcome back to another edition of Musical Talk, where today we're going to be talking again with the wonderful Michael Gordon-Shapiro, long-term presenter of Musical Talk and composer and lyricist in his own right, about some of the shows which he and I saw at this summer's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. You'll remember that last week we discussed a number of shows and heard a number of songs, and we're going to be doing exactly the same again this week. But the two shows we're going to be discussing in this episode are very, very different. The first is called a Jaffa Cake musical, which is the latest musical from Giggle Mug, who you might remember are the people behind Timpson, the musical, and also Runesicle, both shows which we've adored here on Musical Talk over the years. And you may remember a rather wonderful conversation I had with Sam Cochran and Alex Prescott about Runesicle in the last year. Well, Giggle Mug is at it again, and they're carrying on their usual tradition, because they've written another musical about a British company, or at least a British product. And that product is the Jaffa Cake. And if I say, is it a biscuit? Is it a cake? Then you'll get almost all you need to know about this particular musical. But this was a show that had an incredibly high profile at this summer's Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and deservedly so, and got huge numbers of stars in terms of its reviews. 4 and 5 stars from pretty much everybody, from the national press to citizen broadcasters. And in just a minute I'll tell you a little bit more about that show, and we'll have a chance to hear a song. But that was a show which was extremely well advertised, and you couldn't really miss it if you were wandering around Edinburgh this summer. Such was its profile. The second show that Mike and I are going to be talking about today, slightly different. It has the rather remarkably long title of The Greatest Musical the World Has Ever Seen by Randy Thatcher. And by Randy Thatcher is part of the title. It's actually by a man called Matt Howie, who's a singer-songwriter with an enormous reputation online. He's had a great many streams, over 10 million apparently, for many of his songs. But in this show, which Matt wrote, he plays Randy Thatcher. And here's the blurb for the show. Lonely musical composer Randy Thatcher has finally found the confidence to share his magnum opus to an imaginary audience in his bedroom. While performing his show about heartbreak, friendship and intergalactic warfare, Randy realises his life might not be so different from that of his show's protagonist, Gazandi. Written and performed by Matt Howie, the singer-songwriter with 10+ million streams, Randy, on the other hand, has never had anyone listen to his music besides his mum. But he's sure excited to give it a try. But the unusual thing about this show, The Greatest Musical the World Has Ever Seen by Randy Thatcher, is that it's not actually a musical. Or rather, it is a show within a show. But here's the interesting thing. The show which is in the show, i.e. the show which is diegetically being performed for you, in this piece, is the musical. But the piece itself is a play. It's a very unusual combination. It's really a play with a musical at the heart of it. And that musical is performed in part as part of that play. It absolutely falls into the world of musical theatre from our point of view, but it isn't a simple musical. And that's one of the things that makes it so interesting and why I liked it so very much. And you'll hear me untangling that unusual structure in my discussion with Mike later in the episode. But back to a Jaffa Cake musical, which is the conversation we're going to start the show with today. In Britain, a Jaffa Cake is a well-known kind of biscuit or cake, and therein lies the entire point of the show, because its blurb says, time to decide once and for all, cake or biscuit. Inspired by the 1991 tribunal, which determined the true identity of a Jaffa Cake, multi-award-winning Giggle Mug Theatre present a brand new family-friendly musical comedy that takes the biscuit, or cake. And if you're British, you probably have some sense of the very famous story here in Britain that in 1991, the actual status of a Jaffa Cake, whether it be a biscuit or a cake, was tested in court for the exciting reason of taxation levels. And so this is a show which is essentially telling that story. And of course that's interesting too, because that means the constraint of this show is to tell a musical within the confines of a very strictly regulated procedure, in this case, a court case. Well, a Jaffa Cake musical was written by Sam Cochrane, and the arrangements and musical direction for the show were by Rob Gathercole. And I'm delighted to say that Sam has very kindly said that we can play a song from the score. So in a minute we're going to hear a song called The Fork. And as you'll very quickly realise, there's some wordplay in action. And the recording of this song is actually a demo recording by Rob Gathercole. So to recap, in this episode we're just about to hear a song called The Fork from A Jaffa Cake Musical by Giggle Mug Theatre. Then you'll hear a conversation between me and Michael Gordon Shapiro about that show and our experience of it at this year's Festival Fringe. And then Mike and I will continue talking about Matt Howie's interesting show, The Greatest Musical the World Has Ever Seen, by Randy Thatcher. And not unlike the question in A Jaffa Cake Musical, what is the status of a Jaffa Cake? Is it a biscuit or a cake? The Greatest Musical the World Has Ever Seen by Randy Thatcher also has a status question. Is it a musical? Is it a play with a musical in it? I've already told you what I think, but I hope you'll enjoy the conversations you're about to hear. But first, as advertised, let's hear that song from A Jaffa Cake Musical.
Half moon, crescent, total eclipse. Eat it how you like once it touches your lips. How do you two eat them? Chocolate first. I nibble round the edge. Oh, you're well versed. 520 ways to do it. Doesn't matter to me how you choose to chew it. What I want to do is establish the fact that we all use our fingers to enjoy this snack. Kevin, what's her plan? Keep it cool, my man. It's time for some real talk. If a Jaffa Cake's a cake, why don't you eat it with a fork? Whoa, fork, 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 fork. If a Jaffa Cake's a cake, why don't you eat it with a fork? In fact, way back, a robber was caught. He went under oath in this very same court. How'd they catch him and match him? Do you know, Jake? They found his fingerprints on a Jaffa Cake. He couldn't resist when he robbed that house. He saw a box of biscuits the owners left out. Did he set out to get out some cutlery? No, he did something he thought subtler. See, is it frightening you that I'm enlightening you? Do you want to take a little walk? If a Jaffa Cake's a cake, why don't you eat it with a fork? Oh, fork, 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 fork. If a Jaffa Cake's a cake, why don't we eat it with a fork? Still nothing? We'll see about that. Fork, 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 fork. Fork.
Mike, we're going to talk about a musical we've seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year, which is about what I would call a great British delicacy, but I don't even know if you have them in America, a Jaffa Cake. So I think contextually we need to set out our stall. Do you know what a Jaffa Cake is? And if so, how did it come into your life?
I do now, and it came into my life through this musical. However, I had seen enough shows by Giggle Mug previously to know that I might need to do a little bit of research before the show, so I hit Wikipedia, I read about Jaffa Cakes, I read about the amusing legal controversy, which is the basis of the musical, so I felt reasonably well equipped going in. But prior to that frenzied Wikipedia research session, I had never heard of them in my life.
But now you understand that they are, despite the legal outcome, popularly thought of as a biscuit, and they're certainly treated as a biscuit in day-to-day life. And for listeners who aren't British or don't know what a Jaffa Cake is, they're a kind of spongy biscuit base with a kind of orange-flavoured jelly. That's the Jaffa reference, because Jaffa oranges is a term used in this country. It's a brand, but it's often used, hand me a Jaffa, clearly mean give me an orange, a small sort of Satsumari orange, and also they're particularly known for being seedless. So it's also, unfortunately, slang for an infertile gentleman.
Oh.
He's a Jaffa. He's seedless.
That did not come up in the show.
It didn't come up in the show. It's because it's quite slangy. And it has chocolate on the top. So it's essentially a chocolate biscuit with a sponge base, orange jelly and a chocolate on the top. And it's found in the biscuit counter of any supermarket, not in the cake counter. But I think you're quite right. Contextually, this show is about a huge legal case that took place between what was then Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue, which is the tax people, and the manufacturers of the Jaffa cake, as to whether or not it was a biscuit or a cake in real life. How should it be defined for tax purposes? Because there are differential tax rates, unbelievably, for cakes and biscuits in this country. What could be a more fun basis for a musical than a legal case about taxational definitions? And yet, amazingly, it turns out to be quite a good basis for a very successful musical. That is the official position of the Jaffa Cake musical, which is called a Jaffa Cake musical, as though there may well be others. It's an indefinite article, which threw me first of all.
I think it's polite of them to leave room for the possibility of competing Jaffa Cake musicals.
Well, it may happen. You know, and when Six became popular, I remember seeing a show about Henry VIII and his wife called Half a Dozen. I mean, it was as blatant as that.
Didn't we see a couple of alternative Henry VIII wife musicals the year that Six came out?
Yeah, I mean, you know, success breeds success, doesn't it? So we make this light comment. I suspect this is sufficiently esoteric, but there will only ever be one Jaffa Cake musical about this particular legal case. It's an amusing idea, because it's such a centrally ridiculous concept which happened in real life. You know, there was this battle about is this a cake or a biscuit, and it's one of those things that people have been talking about in pubs for years. What did you make of the show? Because the other thing that needs to be said there is it's also quite a narrow basis for a musical.
Well, interestingly, during the course of our recent discussions, we have discussed a couple of shows that seem to be centered around monumental events.
Yes.
By different definitions of monumental. And
certainly historically, speech marks truthful events. Yes.
Exactly. Historically inspired musicals. And this one, I think, did several things right. The idea of this heated courtroom case as to whether or not Jaffa cakes are cakes or biscuits, to use the UK term for cookies.
Oh no, a cookie and a biscuit are quite different.
Are they?
Oh, there's a definitional difference.
Probably another legal case right there.
There may well be. No, a biscuit, a cookie has been cooked once, and a biscuit has been baked twice. It is
by-scuted. Right.
Exactly, it is a biscuit. It is a double-cooked item.
Amazing. And who says this is not an educational podcast? Yeah. So much to think about. So,
which is why they're brittler than a cookie. Carry on, please.
Anyway, it's obviously very funny to have a manufacturer of a biscuit or cake have to go to court to defend the confectionery status of their offering. It's just intrinsically funny. So obviously that was why that was made the basis of a musical. But the creators of the show, from whom we've seen two musicals previously at least.
Two good musicals previously at least, yes.
Knew that, and I'm definitely biasing this to reflect my own opinion, so prepare yourself for that. They knew that for a musical about an event to be emotionally resonant, it had to happen through the lens of characters to whom we felt an emotional connection. So we are seeing the show through the perspective of two lawyers, one on either side of this fight. And
the prosecution and the defense.
Prosecution and the defense. Both of whom have a pre-existing amicable relationship, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And
but with an edge.
Right.
There's an element of rivalry.
Right.
But they're not unfriendly towards each other. Yes.
Exactly. They're not enemies in the sense that they are legally combatants.
Yeah.
And that relationship serves as the clothesline on which can be pinned many songs and funny events. And I think this is a very important idea, because the funniness of the legal proceedings is strong, but it can only sustain you so far in a musical, which he said, once again, reiterating his prior assumptions, really is based on strong personal opinions with which we can empathize. So to have the sort of crisis in confidence of these lawyers who are enemies but yet have a connection and have to come to some sort of reconciliation just as the legal case does, I think it's a very wise approach to this musical, and I think it serves the show very well. I'll draw an analogy to the prior musical we saw by them, which was
RuneScape.
RuneScape, yes. Yeah. RuneScape was the game it was based on. That was based on a video game, and it was a very fun choose-your-own-adventure kind of indeterminate musical where the audience picked where the characters in a on-stage portrayal of a video game went. But there was also an external story about the player of the game and his relationship, if I remember correctly, with his sister.
Correct,
right?
you are 100% correct.
Which was a touching story.
Yeah.
So it added an emotional human element to an event, a zany event.
It was a meta subplot.
Yes. Or a framing device, however you want to think of
Yeah.
it. So I think the broader lesson here is if you've got a crazy, zany event that's funny and can be musicalized, it is best to wrap around it a human story. And that is what this musical did successfully. And thus I was able to enjoy it and still feel a kind of... It wasn't just a silly depiction of events. There was an actual human progression in it that I appreciated.
And just so that, this all matches up with other conversations so that people can realise what we're talking about, there are two shows, I think, that we have discussed elsewhere. There's Wallace, a show about Wallace Simpson, where there isn't a set of characters we feel about because the purpose of that show, I think, is that it's about the question of Wallace Simpson, therefore they can't reveal too much about her. And then there's the Emu War, which is about a real event, whereby, if you like, there's a human story, but it runs in parallel rather than necessarily is instructive of the story itself, or doesn't really connect into the main story.
And we depart from it for a long period of time, whereas I think this show keeps touching base with the two characters.
Integrates it,
yes, exactly right.
So over our discussions here at the Edinburgh Fringe, we've seen 3 shows that offer 3 different ways of doing a historic event musical.
Which is a funny way to think about a legal fight over the tax status of a confection. But that is what it is.
It did, and it took up a lot of pages in the newspaper when it was happening.
So you remember the actual event?
Oh, I absolutely do, and it's still referenced today. It comes up on television periodically. It's just one of those. Quite often in relation to the enormous Jaffa cake that was baked at the end. So we get there's one prop which is constructed into an enormous Jaffa cake, which helps clinch a deal, shall we say? Anyway. But there are still constraints because legal dramas are by nature constrained. A legal musical, it's set in a courtroom. There's a judge. There are the arguments for the plaintiff. There are arguments for the defence. We hear witnesses. We get evidence. It follows loosely and broadly, but a recognisable court sequence. A British trial, which I'm always intrigued by this idea that. What is better for creating? Is it a narrow canvas from which you can bounce off the walls, or is it a broad canvas on which you can build anything? Of course, there's no right or wrong answer to either of those questions. But I was taken by something someone said to me years ago about improv musicals. The magic of an improv musical is that you go into a black box with some actors, that's your theatre, and then anything can happen. But actually, when they do the thing that looks like the magic, where they ask you, the audience, to identify something, and people shout, yes, it's going to be in a prison. Yes, it's a rainy day on a Wednesday. Yes, someone's dressed as a pumpkin. And then you have to construct a musical out of that. And that is the magic. It's actually sleight of hand, because what you've done by immediately calling on the audience to set some parameters. It sounds like come up with something out of the blue, but actually it immediately makes the canvas half a canvas, because if it's set in a prison, suddenly all other possibilities are removed. So you've really narrowed it down. And then you've got 3 people in it, that narrows it down again. Someone's dressed as a pumpkin, well, that suggests a fancy dress party. Once again, it's narrower and narrower. Every suggestion, which seems to be madder and madder, makes it close smaller and smaller. So that's in the improv world, and there's lots of improv musicals, but I was very taken by that. I'm really interested, therefore, in the constraints of a musical which is set to the concept of a trial. And I'm going to briefly go into it because, hey, I would lose my membership card of the Gilbert and Sullivan Society if I had ever joined it, if I didn't mention Trial by Jury, which is the first successful Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, and therefore can be seen as a little bit of an early, at least a godfather of musicals. And certainly of this kind, it is essentially a legal trial. And so is Jaffa Cake musical. But from your point of view as a creator of musicals, Mike, would you find that constraining, or would you find that actually a very nice unit in which to operate? And how do you think Giggle Mug did in their... I mean, you've essentially said very well, but what's your take on the idea of the narrow format musical?
I think that a structure that many musicals adopt, which is very fruitful, is that there is an external conflict of some kind, and there's an internal conflict of some kind. And in some way, those two conflicts interrelate and influence each other, perhaps towards the end of the show. So 2 things that seemed disparate suddenly coincide in an unlikely way. Not every musical has to follow that format, but I think there are opportunities, the rich opportunities. So here we have the interpersonal competition between the two lawyers, which I think we can think of as the internal story because it's psychological. Yeah. The stakes are internal. And then we have the external story of the trial. Having laid out that springboard from which I should shoot my opinion, I have to make sure I remember the question. So,
well, it's would you as a creator find the narrowness of the concept of a trial constraining or invigorating, and then how do you think Giggle Mug did with it?
Right, well, all musicals seek to achieve the universal through the specific. There has to be some particular story, and I would argue the more nuanced the better, and there has to be some sort of overarching general idea that the story can touch upon, or else you have songs that are very much about a specific thing and nothing else.
Too esoteric, yeah. So it's got to be the macro from the micro.
Right. You never want a song that is literally about the events that are about to happen or have just happened. You always want them to touch into some broader idea. In Hamilton, I don't know why I keep using Hamilton references, but he is constantly touching back to, I'm not going to throw away my shot. So in the middle of whatever kind of situation he's gotten into, he touches back to the idea of destiny and fulfilling one's potential. So I think this show, where I feel like it might have faltered somewhat, is tying the songs to a broader empathetic idea. Many of the songs I noticed seem to be kind of a blow-by-blow description of where we were in the process of this trial.
Almost documentary-like. It's a documentary musical again, in that sense.
Exactly. Yeah. Without also touching base to some sort of broader idea. Now, this was the first show I saw at Fringe, and I've seen many shows since then, so please correct me if I'm forgetting something or not representing something fairly. That is entirely possible. But I got the sense that I was just kind of, a succession of songs were almost just describing the next phase of the trial without tying to some more general idea, perhaps the internal struggle more consistently, or some broader notion of why we should care.
Well, that's... Once again, this is the constraint of a real life trial as well, not just an imagined one. So the way I remember it is that there's a song for the defence and there's a song for the prosecution. Prosecution go first, of course. And if I remember rightly, they were each allowed 3 arguments. I'm sure in the actual taxation case there were rather more than 3, and I'm sure they went on for rather more than just the length of the song. Let's say 3 to 4 minutes. No lawyer would allow that. But you're right. What we got was the 3 arguments, and then the judge sort of deciding on whether or not they had much quality, plus the internal insecurity of the 2 barristers in question as to whether or not their arguments were sufficient, whilst at the same time that odd kind of professional, this is the killer blow thing. So, if you like, insecurity and posturing, which is so much part of human nature, in a formal environment of a court, where the posturing or the positioning is framed as an intellectual exercise, normally rather than an emotional exercise. That's the danger I see. That, it's who's got the killer argument, and that argument cannot be an emotional argument because that just simply won't run in a court.
Right.
And may not run in a court. So there is that sort of constraint in the danger of a musical about a trial. But as you say, it's lightened by the personal. And that's almost the only way of getting it in, because trials are very dull and very dry. And a taxation trial more so, even if you have what you might call a celebrity artifact at the heart of it.
The show is good in that it also carries along as a secondary sympathetic character I think the head of the company that creates Java cakes.
Yeah, they are Jaffa cakes.
Jaffa cakes, not Java. The show does do something that I think is smart, which it carries along as a kind of secondary sympathetic character, the head of the company that makes Jaffa cakes, who is bewildered and taken aback and is very concerned. So whereas we might not necessarily take to heart the struggle of a corporation to achieve more favorable tax status, we can look at the guy who's the head of the company and say, all right, poor fellow, he's trying to bring the world joy.
As he sings, I think.
Indeed, and he has a musical input as well. So that's smart. So that gives us a reason to care about the outcome of the trial beyond just how it might impact the self-esteem of 2 lawyers.
Yeah, so oddly, you're right, the human face of a corporate organisation is the human element in this musical. The true human element in this musical. You feel that he's sort of genuinely upset, on an altruistic basis, on a philanthropic basis, about the reduction in pleasure that a change in taxation on Jaffa cakes will produce in the world. And he personally, they are actually owned by a big company. But it's like he's the personal baker of Jaffa cakes and he's the inventor.
Right, he's like Willy Wonka, essentially.
Yeah,
Someone who has an emotional connection to his candy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a very interesting parallel, I think. So yeah, he is the human face, and he's vulnerable. He's also quite a vulnerable character. He's not secure. He's not bombastic. He's looking for. He himself would not cope very well in a court environment if he was testifying himself.
Right.
Very strong sense that his barrister is his salvation, and the barrister, who's our central character in some senses, there's a kind of friendly relationship. They sort of become buddies, but there's also this kind of will they, won't they, professional, on-off, antagonistic, but possibly affectionate relationship between the two barristers, and that is our human heart.
Right.
And it's all on the periphery, and the judge does exactly what you'd expect a judge to do. They are there for the functioning of umpire. I'm not sure where that takes us though. So it is interesting, isn't it, that they've had to sort of staple on emotional characters.
Well, I don't know if I would use the term staple on, because I think these characters are organic to the situation.
That's fair.
They're not gratuitous. They may be fictionalized. And I think that's a fair thing to do in such it's a whimsical show. It's not meant to give us factual information.
It's very much in the giggle mug mould, isn't it?
Yes,
It's actually terribly affectionate all the way through.
Right.
You've got to have a sense that you like the companies which are being promoted, or their product at least.
Yes, I mean, the word giggle is in the name of the company, so they're telling you where they're coming from emotionally. So yeah, I think it was a smart move, and I think my complaint, if any, comes just from the songs being a little linear and not having as much interest beyond the literal thing they are commenting on at that moment.
But we've spent a little time talking about the format and the way that works. Ultimately, would you say it was successful?
Yeah, given its obvious intent of taking a event from real life that has intrinsic humorous qualities and turning it into a larger-than-life exposition of musical energy and tying in some characters who we can find endearing. That was a long sentence. Yes, is the short version.
What I find interesting, though, is I think it's a departure for Giggle Mug. Or rather, they've gone to the other end of their spectrum. Because if we take their two main previous shows, Timpson the Musical, which lives basically in an imaginary, off-kilter Victorian world, that is not a real-world situation. That is very reimagined. Yes, it's a world where keys haven't been invented, for goodness sake. And then you've got the RuneScape world, where you've actually got a plethora of different environments, because that's built into the nature of the product, the game, and indeed there's one or two added to that as well. But, will we go to the caves? Will we go to the dungeons? Here we are in the castle. Here we are in the village. Here we are at the baker's. That's all built in. So these are expansive or imaginary landscapes. And then suddenly we're in the complete opposite of that, which is we're in a room, courtroom. We're limited cast, judge, maker of Jaffa cakes and two barristers, essentially. And so it's much more constrained. And therefore it's quite interesting to me to see the same creative team trying to produce the same tonal effect as they've had in their very successful previous shows in a much more constrained environment. Now, I think they're very successful, but it does feel constrained, but then it's got to feel constrained. Because there's sort of no, you don't have open-air courts in the United Kingdom for a lot of reasons. Who wants all those lovely horsehair wigs flowing across the field?
Right.
But it doesn't disappoint. It just feels different. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, very badly, that I very much enjoyed the show. I think it's a great show. It's highly whimsical. It's highly funny. It's absurd, which is their sort of stock in trade. It's terribly funny. Once again, and that's what I want from this musical. I enjoyed it all, but it just feels very different. I do, at one level, oddly enough, I was transported into the public gallery of a court. And that is not unlike a theatre. But it's a much narrower world that they're playing in, and they can do it. So actually, they've shown me that they can go from micro musical, if you like, the smallest possible world to the biggest possible world.
And maybe the fact that they didn't have as free a hand in creating the world of the show as they did in the prior two leads to
contextually, yeah.
Maybe it leads to the more limited role of the songs in terms of advancing the story. In that there weren't crazy characters to
no freaky troll this time.
I was going to give that exact example from Rumsical. because they kept the events fairly literal, as a musical comedy could, maybe that limited the songs in a way that they weren't limited in the more far-ranging, imaginative worlds of the prior two shows.
But overall, though,
it was a good time.
Yeah, and that's all one can ask for. You know, it's a silly musical which does silliness terribly well, and I went in delighted, and I came out even more delighted. What I didn't do, however, is pop off and buy a Jaffa cake. But hey. So subliminally, it may not be doing much for the profits. But
maybe I should have done so as a way of feeling the issue more directly.
Yeah.
I should have one before I leave this continent.
What a sentence! I must have a Jaffa cake before I leave the continent.
Absolutely. When else am I going to have the opportunity?
Well, another show that I saw that you didn't see, Mike, was called The Greatest Musical the World Has Ever Seen by Randy Thatcher.
With that title, I'm sad to have missed it.
Yes. And by Randy Thatcher is in the title. And Randy Thatcher is the central and indeed only character in the piece. It was a really interesting but very curious way of doing a musical. And that's sort of why I want to touch upon it. The conceit is that our actor, who's not called Randy Thatcher, plays a young man with anxiety problems. I think he's in his late teens or his very early 20s. He's in his university room, but it becomes apparent over time that his anxiety has meant that there's been a number of occasions when he's had to abort being at university and sort of go back home for the comfort of home because of his anxiety. But this year he's trying to stick it out. And the way he's not a man with a great number of friends, so he lives in a kind of imaginary world. And he loves musicals, so he wants to write a musical. But he's written a musical, which he's called The Greatest Musical the World Has Ever Seen. You know, with that kind of, I've heard all the musical scores, I've seen a number of musicals, I now know what you require, so I've written one myself. And then what he does is he sings us some songs from the music. He doesn't sing the full musical, he sings some songs from the musical whilst telling us the story through glove puppets. You know, throwback to the EU War.
Yeah.
But his is set in space, so it's a sci-fi musical. And he's got these lovely little sort of glove puppets. There's a green one with 3 eyes, who's the male character, and there's a sock puppet, which is, I think she had 2 eyes, who was the female character. And they live on an alien planet which has just been attacked by another alien planet, which is entirely populated by irredeemable thugs. You know, there's not much nuance in this. It really is. It's quite simplistic. It's alien boy meets alien girl. Their planet having just seen off these aliens somehow, but the aliens are saying they're going to come back and destroy them all later. So there's a kind of threat of death. But they sort of carry on in their own way, and it's sort of cute in the sense how mundane and pathetic the lives of our two, our hero and heroine are, because they are just sort of hanging out with the kind of end of the world hanging over them. You know, they have no power, they have no locus. There's jeopardy, but they don't have any leverage. They're just Jack and Jill Bloggs, I suppose, under the circumstances. They just happen to be alien glove puppets. But, they talk cutely, and he plays them, and they're having dialogue, and you would call it mal dialogue. It's the kind of conversation you have in a shopping centre. They're obviously getting a coffee somewhere, or whatever alien coffee they have, and they're chatting. And then you get the songs. So, he tells you a bit of the story, it's narrated, and then he sings the song. It's him at his keyboard, singing the song, and then he tells you a bit more of the plot, and then he sings the song, and then he tells you a bit more of the plot, and then he sings the song. Now, that sounds negative and critical. I don't mean it to sound negative and critical. That is the structure of the piece. And therefore what you're getting is, you're getting a selection of songs from the piece, because actually there's quite a lot of narrative doing quite a lot of the work. So you get some of the nexus points, mostly on the emotional story, which is, it has to be said, and I think it's deliberately so, a somewhat hackneyed, it's a space adventure which isn't a space adventure, it's just a standard boy meets girl set in space, on no budget, with songs written by, ostensibly, let's call him a 20-year-old. And they are the kind of songs you would expect a 20-year-old, they're quite angsty, they're in the American pop tradition, there's quite a lot of, let's start the song with a repeated chord and then sing the melody over that repeated chord. And I'm not musical, but I spotted that it's... And what's interesting to me about this show is I can't work out whether this is a stroke of genius, or I think it must be that you are invited to say you are watching a 20-year-old's musical and expected to take it as a 20-year-old's musical. The idea that it's sock puppets who are space creatures is a little bit juvenile. It says 14-year-old to me, much as I love science fiction. It's pulp science fiction. It's not Asimov.
So if I can...
Yes, please do.
Not recap, but mid-cap, since you're in the middle of describing it. What we have is something that could be seen as a workshop or presentation of a musical, but not presented by the literal author, but a fictionalized representative of that author.
A younger version of the author, yes, absolutely. And also, but it falls into the trap of tell, not show. Because there's no drama. He's got two desks. The action in the piece as he moves on his wheelchair from the desk where his keyboard is, where he's telling you the story, to the subplot, which is his mother checking in on him on his laptop computer. So he goes off and has the occasional virtual telephone call.
Okay.
Which is where we get his character issues. You know, she's always checking up, and she's a very, very loving, but perhaps slightly over-loving mother. You know, slightly swamping, domineering. But she's well-intentioned. And so that is, if you like, I think that's the subplot. You know, there's the musical and then there's the subplot. It's noticeable that the songs relate to... all the songs, therefore, are diegetic. You are being told, this is a song from a musical, hear the song.
But in a sense they are, right? But also if we imagine the world he's describing, or rather if we treat his world as the real world of the show, then there's sort of... I don't know if there's a term to describe pertaining to a reality within a reality, but yeah. It's sort of like in Rumsical, where you have the songs that reflected the reality of the game versus the player of the game.
Yeah, exactly. Show within a show, if you like, said Mr. Shakespeare. So it's interesting. But the problem is the constraints, and we were talking about constraints when we were talking about the Jaffa Cake musical, are both a positive and a negative. It's really interesting to see a musical. What you're being offered up is quite cheeky. You're getting a partial musical with narration, but with a subplot story, which is the real story of the human involved, the chap who's writing the piece, Randy, in fact. And by the way, you'll be pleased to know that the alien invasion is faulted, but we hear that rather than see it. So, as I say, we're offered the emotional nexus points, but we don't get any of the dramatic nexus points. And of course, by not getting any of the dramatic nexus points, the emotional nexus points are, to a degree, theoretical. You know, they're certainly diminished. But at one level, the very thing this isn't, and it knows it isn't, is the greatest musical the world has ever seen, by Randy Thatcher or otherwise. However, this might well be the greatest musical by Randy Thatcher the world has ever seen. I think that's where this is going. And then we do see some personal growth. So as a person, he goes on to sing some of his songs. He sort of fights his anxiety and goes to a talent night. He and accidentally ends up joining the local amateur dramatics group.
Oh, nice.
And makes friends. I mean, that's how it ends. He goes from solitary to social through his musical. So his musical is a catalyst for his own life.
Is the songs that are in the musical within the musical, do they metaphorically relate to his own real-life struggles?
I think we have to interpret it that way. I mean, the difference is his alien boy and girl meet and have formed a relationship, and it's very clear that he hasn't, although there's a potential that he might meet someone amongst his group of friends that he ends up with.
So it's a projection of his
desires.
It's
a projection of his desires. That's exactly what it is. And it's odd, as I say, it's an odd thing, because his life is so small because of his anxiety and mental health difficulties, that his idea that the greatest musical the world has ever seen is also so small. So there's a beautiful layering going on, but the flip side to that is that there's a kind of shortfall in the musical itself, but almost because there has to be. And that's really interesting to me as a lover of musical theatre. But actually the story is infinitely more sophisticated because of the failure of the musical within it. And that's quite hard to evaluate. I hope I'm getting that across. Its smallness makes the show bigger. But of course, if you're there for the musical, you're getting a small musical.
Is there enough sustained interest in Randy's story, the framing story, throughout the show that keeps you engaged in the musical he's describing, because you know that he's really projecting his own emotional state into this inner musical? Or is it that you are expected to treat the inner musical as the entertainment and you're finding it lacking for that reason?
Oh, terribly good question. He emotionally responds to the calls he has with his mother, because she's obviously pushing him because it's good for him, but he doesn't want to be pushed because of the anxiety. And so you do see him roll from his laptop to his keyboard and just start plucking away. He's also sent this to a new writing competition, and has childish expectations that it's going to be selected because it's the greatest music in the world.
Does he go in thinking that he's created a masterpiece, or is that
Yes, I think you have to believe that he does think that. Or he certainly thinks he's got something of worth, and he's furious. Well, he then gets the telephone call that says you've not... He gets the email telling he's not been selected, and in a rare moment of dynamism, he phones the organiser, and he discovers the organiser didn't read his musical. So that's a real dejection moment. And not only that, there's a kind of salt rubbed into the wounds because a new version of Hamlet has been picked. And he says, but it's a new writing. How's Hamlet new writing? It's an adaptation by an up-and-coming playwright. So they've gone for the starry option. And you can feel his despair, and that's when you do see him crumple. You see his dejection and the unfairness of it all. And he sort of slumps towards his keyboard and then sort of picks at it. So you do see that the music has been his lifeline, because it seems to be his safe zone. It's where he goes. So it's odd. Just by discussing it with you, funnily enough, I'm seeing a lot more in the piece, and now I appreciate it much more as a subtle psychological exploration of the character through essentially a show which fails absolutely to live up to its title as being the greatest musical in the world, but deliberately so.
Because I guess it's describing how he sees the show.
Yes.
In his mind, rather than representing it to us that way. Although we would never know that just by looking at the title externally.
Well, I think the clue's there, though, isn't it? It's the addition of by Randy Thatcher.
Is there a comma before the by Randy Thatcher? Or?
I don't think so. I think it's the whole thing. I think it's almost like, the new stories of Sherlock Holmes by me. It's as I say, there's that sense of juvenile behaviour, even though he's a 20-year-old or so. He's obviously been away from social contact and therefore is still slightly infantile.
It's like when you go to a restaurant in a small town and it says, like, world-famous waffles. Like,
oh, yeah, really?
Of course it's not world-famous waffles. I barely know where your town is. But
there's no one in the next postcode who knows about these waffles.
I mean, I obviously haven't seen the show, but I think that kind of misplaced hubris can be endearing if you sense that somebody really believes they've created this.
Endearing is the word. And the character gets his potential happy ending, and that is the right outcome for this show. But it's beautifully low-key. But as I say, it's really on discussing it with you that I've seen its hidden layers more clearly than I did when I came out of it and in the show itself, which is also quite interesting.
Well, it's the advantage of getting the perspective of somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. It makes you consolidate what you do know when you do know what you're talking about.
Well, I think somewhere there's a compliment hidden in that, but I might play the old great switcheroo and say, but I am the man who knows nothing of which they speak, so...
You sound pretty confident about that, so I'd have to question it. It does sound like a nice premise for a show, and from my outsider point of view, I would say that a lot of what I would anticipate is the success of the show rides on how well you can connect the musical within the musical to the character you care about, which is the author.
And I think there are opportunities to do that. And it's a pity, in a way, that I have to say that if you were asking me what a critique of the piece would be, it's that the music is very samey. It is a magnificent underscoring of the character of Randy Thatcher, but actually that, he doesn't have the greatest musical skills in the world, and this is a teenage passion project which isn't going to flower. But obviously, once again, we're back to the fact that the songs, the chord bashing, one song after the other, can become a little bit tiring. But as I say, that may be the point of it.
Have you ever seen on stage or on Netflix Tick, Tick, Boom?
By Jonathan Larson. I have never actually seen it. I've heard it. I've listened to the score.
As an aside, the Netflix adaptation is actually far superior to the stage version that I saw.
That's very interesting.
They really draw out what makes the show endearing. But anyway, you have another case of a musical theater composer who has a kind of musical within this musical that we get glimpses of. And it doesn't seem all that great, but it doesn't matter because we view it as something related to the needs of the character rather than the entertainment in its own right.
But there are songs outside of that, though, as well.
Yes,
yeah. And this show doesn't. Right. But it's an interesting parallel, genuinely interesting parallel. And you just made me think that we probably ought to have a chat about the Tick, Tick, Boom Netflix series at some stage.
Yeah, you should watch it.
I ought.
It's good. It's just a single movie for Netflix, but it's very well done.
I'm up for that.
That goes for all of you out there listening too. You should go watch that.
Channeling the ghost of Jonathan Larson.
Yeah. He deserves something.
Oh, he does. Yeah, no, he was a great composer, and it's just a pity we've been missing so many of them. What might have been, but there we are. Well, thank you, Mike. That's been very interesting, talking about two shows where the constraint has been part of the musical.
It's a good way of unifying those two.
Yeah. Very, very different shows, very different feels, but there is that kind of writing in the box kind of musical. Mike, I look forward to many more conversations about the EdFringe, but into the future. But actually, I think there's plenty more meat on the bone for 24, so I have no doubt we'll be talking again. And I look forward to it.
All right, till next time.
By mistake, many times I've left food out in the open. I'd say that's the real crime, so put me in handcuffs. Objection! If I'm disbarred, remember these words I've spoken. A cake goes hard, but a biscuit goes soft. Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? It's all okay, our lucky day. Is he hard or soft? We put this to the test and left out a plate of Jaffas. When they'd gone past their best, I took a little bite. I almost chipped a tooth, so let it be known hereafter. We speak the truth and the defense is right. Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? I think this may be Judgment Day. Is he hard or soft? I am Lady Justice with her kitchen scales. People all entrust us to be fair, but judges are just humans wearing frilly wigs. I will rock my costume and my hair, this I swear. Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? It's all okay, our lucky day. Is he hard or soft? Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? I think this may be Judgment Day. Is he hard or soft?
And there you are, a very special extra song. That's a second song from a Jaffa Cake musical called Hard or Soft, which of course is thematically in keeping in terms of that question, the trial that show's all about whether a Jaffa Cake is a cake or a biscuit. Is it hard or is it soft? And I'm particularly grateful to Sam Cochran there because he's rushed that recording to me for inclusion in this show. So whilst the song may be about food going stale, this song is as fresh as it can be. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing both songs from a Jaffa Cake musical. And I hope too that you've enjoyed hearing conversations with me and Michael Gordon Shapiro. And it was so wonderful to see him at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe and have a chance to sit down with him and talk about the shows. As you could hear in the background, we're in a venue that had a pool table right here in River City, or in this case Edinburgh, which I think makes for an interesting percussion background to our conversation. But nothing beats live person-to-person discussion, so I hope that you enjoyed listening to Mike as we discussed the greatest musical the world has ever seen by Randy Thatcher, which is its full title, as I said, really by a man called Matt Haughey. And just so you know, his surname is spelt Haughey. And you can find him very easily online. And hear many of the songs that he's written over the years. And before that, we had a conversation about a Jaffa Cake musical by Giggle Mug Theatre. A show written and produced by Sam Cochran, with arrangements and musical direction by Rob Gathercole, and it was Rob you heard singing in the song The Fork, which preceded the entire conversation. Two very different shows, but two very excellent shows in totally different ways. I'd be delighted to see either of them again. Well, that's it for this week. There's more musical talk next week, and the week after, and the week after that, etc., until such time as there isn't. But with more than 860 episodes under our belt, we're not thinking of giving up anytime soon. So why not join us next week, or whenever, for another episode when we'll be talking about, well, whatever it is we're talking about. There's certainly lots more Edinburgh Festival Fringe coverage to be discussing, so come back next time and find out if that's what we're doing. Or something totally different. But until then, I see that the sun has gone to bed, and so must I. So let me just close this episode in the now traditional way, and carrying on from the theme, so long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Michael Gordon Shapiro and Thos Ribbits, and edited by Thos Ribbits, with audio cleanup by Michael Gordon Shapiro. Copyright Musical Talk 2024, except for the songs, where the copyright remains with the creators. And my enormous thanks to those people for allowing me to play their wonderful songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos. Are you happy with that?
I am. That was a lot of fun.
It did actually feel like it. Now I've spoken about that, but genuinely, I've actually
like it more?
My appreciation of that has gone right up. And actually, you might, if it's still on, you might even want to consider seeing it because I'd love your view.
But I'll consider that an endorsement of the show.